So Donald Trump will be inaugurated on the 20th of January, Monday, as the 47th President of the United States. It was a deeply and hotly contested election in which Trump won fair and square. It's a big mandate. It's a second term. And usually they say for U.S. presidents, the second term is all about history and legacy and what they leave behind, how they will be remembered by history. So how will Trump want to be remembered in his second term? Joining us now is someone who has kept a close eye on U.S. and international politics. Professor John Mearsheimer is with the Department of Politics at the University of Chicago. Thank you very much, Professor, for speaking with us, and Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year to you, and thanks for having me on the show.
So let's start with Trump. Early next week, he will be sworn into office as the 47th President of the United States. What do you think is going to be the top 2 or 3 agenda items for him in this second term?
Well, it's very clear that in terms of foreign policy, the Ukraine issue is front and center, the Iran issue is front and center, and the whole question of a Gaza ceasefire is front and center. So he has these 3 big foreign policy issues that he has to deal with very quickly. And the fact is, he's going to have great difficulty solving any one of those 3 problems. So they'll be haunting him for a long time. And then on the domestic front, it seems to me that the main issue he's concerned about is moving illegal immigrants out of the country. And don't think he's going to be able to do that. But if he tries to do that, that will be a Herculean task that will be equally as difficult as those 3 foreign policy problems he faces.
Let's talk about the foreign policy problems. The Israel-Hamas situation. There's a lot of reports this week that they're close to, clinching a deal. It's just a matter of time, and it'll likely get done before Trump assumes office. Do you see that happening? What may be the broad contours? And if it does happen before Trump takes office, who takes credit for it?
Well, I think if it does happen, and I do think it's likely to happen because the Israelis are exhausted and the Israelis are suffering significant casualties in Gaza. There's all this talk in the mainstream media in the United States that Israel has won all these great victories and is in great shape today. That's simply not true. And in Gaza, they're in real trouble. So there's a lot of pressure on Netanyahu to cut a deal and get most of the hostages back. And of course, Hamas has a vested interest in the deal as well. I think they will get a deal. The question is, what will happen after that? Will the deal stick? Will they get a meaningful ceasefire over the long term? That's much more questionable. And of course, that's of great importance. Who will get credit for it? I think, although both sides deserve credit, and what's happening on the ground is the real driving force, not what either one of these presidents has done. But I think that Trump will get the credit for this. And by the way, I think that when the Ukraine war is finally lost, it will look like it's Trump's fault because Biden has done a brilliant job of kicking the can down the road and leaving office with Ukraine still in the fight. And if Ukraine drops out of the fight during the time when Trump is president, it will look like it's Trump's fault. But back to Gaza, I think that Trump will brag and will look like he's responsible for the agreement that I think, are going to get.
So on Russia-Ukraine, it's a little more difficult because any deal between the Russians and the Ukrainians will necessarily involve Ukraine having to give up a substantial amount of territory, which it had 3 years ago before this war began. How does Trump convince Zelensky to take such a deal? I mean, he might have to give up anywhere between 1/5 and 1/4 of Ukrainian territory.
Well, you want to remember there's one other very important dimension to the deal that the Russians are insisting on, that the Ukrainians and the West will find exceedingly difficult to swallow. And that is that Ukraine cannot be in NATO. And in fact, Ukraine cannot have meaningful security arrangements with the West. This is, at this point in time, a non-starter in the West and certainly in Ukraine, in addition to the point that you made about territory. And when you add these 2 factors together, you have to say to yourself, how is it possible to get a deal? Even if Trump agrees to these 2 factors or these two clauses or these two dimensions of an agreement that the Russians want, it's hard to see him being able to sell it, certainly to the Ukrainians, but even in the West.
Now, I want to come to some of the things that Trump has said since winning the election. And I guess the most outrageous has been the stuff that he's been saying about Greenland and making Canada the 51st state and annexing Panama Canal, if it comes down to that, by even military means, if that's the choice on the table. What's he playing at? I mean, because on the face of it, it sounds outrageous that in the 21st century you would talk about annexing territory and so on and so forth. It sounds so much like, the 18th century and Pax Americana and so on. What's he playing at? Should we just believe Trump at face value at what he's saying, or is there something going on beneath the surface?
Well, the first point I'd make is that Trump is a truly amazing individual. I don't mean that in a positive or a negative way. I've never seen anybody like him. And he's the sort of person who just says whatever he thinks. He doesn't think long and hard about, whether it makes sense to make this argument or not. He just talks off the top of his head. And he's come to realize he can get away with it. So it's truly amazing how many outrageous statements he makes and how little consequence it has. I think with regard to Canada, the idea that Canada is going to become the 51st state is not a serious argument. And that makes you wonder why he's saying this. Of course, what he wants to do is he wants to humiliate Justin Trudeau, and he wants to remind the Canadians that we, the United States, we are the boss. And when we tell you to jump, your only question is how high. With regard to Panama, who knows? There's no threat from China involving the Panama Canal. But he's just, feels that he wants to tell everybody in South America and Central America that we're in charge. Greenland, I think, is a different matter. I think everybody understands that there's going to be a security competition in the Arctic. And a lot of this, by the way, is due to fallout from the Ukraine war. And you're going to have this security competition that matters. And the Russians are up there big time. And if you look at their exclusive economic zone in the Arctic, it is by far the biggest. The United States has a tiny exclusive economic zone up in the Arctic, mainly involving Canada. And Greenland looks like it would help us if we controlled it for purposes of a security competition in the Arctic. So you can see where he's going on that one. But the way he talks about it and the ideas that he has are really quite shocking, and it's hard to imagine the United States conquering Greenland. But it is possible, not likely, but it is possible that he would try to do that.
I do want to. That brings me to a sort of fundamental challenge that he'll have to deal with in his second term from a foreign policy prism, which is how does he deal with China? How does he deal with Russia? With China, I know that he's invited Xi Jinping for his inauguration. Xi apparently is sending a high-level representative. With the Russians, there's already talk, and the Kremlin is talking about a possible meeting between Putin and Trump within the first 100 days of his second term. How does he deal with these two countries and the leaders of these two countries?
I think the best way to answer your question is to remember that Trump, and this was true of Biden, faced three big problems. One is the Middle East, two is Russia, and three is China. And because the Biden administration has been, and the Trump administration will be in so much trouble in Russia/Ukraine, number one, and two, in the Middle East, with Iran, Gaza, Hezbollah, and so forth and so on, the United States wants to minimize the amount of trouble that it has in East Asia. If you think about a conflict breaking out now in the South China Sea between the United States and China, that is the last thing that the United States needs, because it's up to its eyeballs in alligators in both the Middle East and in Ukraine. So I don't anticipate Trump picking a meaningful fight with the Chinese. That is, if he is smart, if he is strategic. But it is possible, Trump being Trump, that he will pick a fight with the Chinese, and then we will end up in really serious trouble in three different areas of the world, which is not what we need at this point in time.
But what about the opposite? What if you're Xi Jinping and you're looking at, how much Trump has on his plate. And we know that, for the Chinese and particularly for Xi Jinping, Taiwan is a very sensitive issue. Is he looking at the world and saying, okay, now is perhaps the time for me to make that move on Taiwan?
You can make that argument. This looks like what we call in the international relations world a window of opportunity. But the problem that Xi Jinping faces is that he has significant economic problems on the home front. Yeah. And those economic problems morph into political problems. And the last thing he needs from a domestic politics point of view is to start a conflict over Taiwan or in the South China Sea. I would also add that I think militarily there's not much he can do about Taiwan at this point in time, even though the United States is pinned down in the Middle East and in Ukraine. The balance of forces don't favor a war over Taiwan from China's point of view. The South China Sea is a different issue. I think there's more room for the Chinese to push hard in the South China Sea. But again, as I said, if you look at domestic considerations from a Chinese point of view, I think they don't want to take advantage of the window of opportunity that you described.
So that brings me to India and the United States. There's a lot of focus in the Trump administration, as you said, on immigration, primarily on illegal immigration. But there seems to be now a divide on this whole H-1B visa issue. And as you know, a lot of Indian technology companies, a lot of Indian techies work in the U.S. on an H-1B visa, which was intended to be a temporary one, but now lots of them have been living there for a number of years on H-1B. Trump has sort of changed his position on that issue. Do you reckon this will become a point of sort of conflict or confrontation between India and the United States?
No, I don't think so. I think the Indians have played their cards well in terms of dealing with the Biden administration, and they'll continue to do the same with the Trump administration. The Indians understand they don't want an adversarial relationship with the United States, but they also don't want to get too close to the United States. The Indians want to maximize the amount of maneuver room they have on the diplomatic front. And I think that the Indian government has done an excellent job from India's point of view in that regard. With regard to immigration, this is a very complicated issue. There are a lot of people who don't like immigration at all. Mm-hmm. Those people are in the Trump administration. They're Trump supporters. The fact is, the United States has a profound interest in having lots of immigration over the long term, not just Indians, but all sorts of people, because the birth rate in the United States is very low, and to maintain a viable economy over the long term, and because we are an immigrant culture, we have a deep-seated interest in bringing lots of immigrants in. And bringing in very well-educated and smart Indians is a smart thing to do, because you can never have enough people who are really smart and can work in places like Silicon Valley and make the economy hum. And the fact that their skin color is different than my skin color has never mattered that much in the United States. And as we move forward, it's mattering less and less and less, because the United States is an increasingly less white country, if you want to talk about skin color. And again, we are an immigrant culture, which is a wonderful thing. It's been our strength all along. It will be our strength moving forward. So this is not to say there won't be some bumps along the road with regard to immigration in general and with regard to bringing Indians into the country. But I think over the long term, this is a no-brainer. Bring in all the smart Indians you can, and in a sense, bring in lots of immigrants. And the key is to integrate them into the American culture, make them Americans. And that's actually not that difficult to do if you're smart. And we have been smart over the centuries. And I'm choosing my words carefully. I mean, my relatives came from Ireland and Germany. And when they came across, they were not viewed as good Americans at first, but they were integrated into the society. And again, this is what has made our country, the United States, great. And we should continue down that road. And again, bring in all the Indians you can, in my opinion.
But tell me this, within the Trump orbit, as it were, there seems to be this divide. You have, on the one hand, his donors, the tech bros, as they are known, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. And I think this whole flare-up happened after one of his positions in government was announced. One of his nominees was announced, Sriram Krishnan. I think he's appointed him to some tech role. Again, Indian immigrant, but now U.S. citizen. So those folks, the tech bros, want the high-tech STEM grads, the science and technology, engineering, medicine grads to come into the U.S. because they see the value that these high-tech immigrants bring into the United States, as you just articulated. And then you have Trump's MAGA base, represented by people like Steve Bannon and Laura Loomer, who are saying all immigrants are bad. At what point does Trump, this is right now simmering under the surface, but at some point this is going to blow up. When does he choose between the donor, the folks who backed him for a second term, and his base? Or does he not care about his base because, he's not running again? You can only run 2 terms, and this is his second term.
Well, I think that there are a lot of issues on the table that Trump is facing, and he can appease his MAGA base on other issues, and he can go against his MAGA base on other issues. And I think this is an issue on which he will go with the tech bros. And if he doesn't, he'll change his mind relatively quickly, because this is essential for making the American economy work. And I think in the end, that is what matters the most. So I just don't see this as that big a problem moving forward.
I do want to, since we're talking tech bros, the role of Elon Musk and his tweets, and especially, the way he's been going after some of the governments in Europe. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, the French President Emmanuel Macron. In Germany, he's openly backed the far-right AfD party. And there's a lot of consternation in Europe that they see this as, potentially foreign interference. How do you see that playing out? Because many of these are, steadfast U.S. allies, and Musk, is probably the second most powerful man, in the incoming Trump administration after the president himself.
Well, as I said before, Trump says a lot of outrageous things because he knows he can get away with it. And I think when you talk about Elon Musk saying outrageous things about the Europeans, he does it and Trump tolerates it because he can get away with it. The Europeans are like our lapdogs, right? We just slap the Europeans around and they don't push back hardly at all. We tell them to jump, and their only question is, how high should we jump? This is the position India wants to make sure it doesn't get into. But the fact that Elon Musk has been saying all of these controversial things in Europe does not matter very much. The Europeans are so desperate to keep the Americans involved in Europe and providing security for Europe that Musk and Trump himself can treat them with contempt and get away with it.
All right, so one final word. We're all preparing for 4 pretty tumultuous years in the White House, given what the first term was like between 2016 and 2020. You think we're going to see a more unvarnished version of Trump, or is it going to be a more tempered version of Trump?
Well, it's important to emphasize that in his first term between 2017 and 2021, he was a pretty normal American president. I mean, he said a lot of outrageous things, but in terms of the actual policy, he was not that unusual. His argument is that he was constrained by the deep state, by the political forces in the country. He was, in a sense, in an iron cage, and he was inexperienced, and his advisors were not the best, and therefore the deep state beat him. His argument is, this time around, I've learned, I have advisors who are on board with my agenda, and I am going to be a radical president. I am going to be very different than the president I was last time. And the question you have to ask yourself is, who's going to win? And there are 2 ways of cutting at this. One is the deep state going to win again? Or to put it in slightly different terms, is the structure of the situation that he's in, both at home and abroad, so powerful, right, independent of the deep state, that he has limited maneuver room. and he's going to end up being a rather normal president. On the Middle East and on Ukraine, for example, he's going to end up looking a lot like Joe Biden. And I would bet, I'm not 100% sure because Trump is special in all sorts of ways, but I would bet that in the end, he's not that different than Joe Biden on a lot of issues. And he's not that different than he was the first time around because there are limits to what you can do, whether you're the Prime Minister of India or you're the President of the United States. You're in a certain social environment that has a lot of power over you. You are, in a way, in an iron cage.
All right, we'll leave it at that. He says he wants to break free from that iron cage. Whether or not he'll be successful, we'll wait and see. Professor Mearsheimer, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time and your perspective.